Good afternoon, boys and girls. Just checking out. Oh, look at this book I was reading here. Jane Fonda, My Life So Far. Maybe I'll give this to my dad. I'm just kidding, actually. I would never give this to my dad, except maybe as a gag gift, because this lady was some uh, famous actress, and she was young, and everybody loved her, and all that stuff. And she went to North Vietnam, and she was a celebrity there, and they treated her nice. And she took a tour of the prison where they were keeping the American soldiers and pilots and all that stuff. And she sat on some of the weapons that were shooting down our aircraft, and it was a big publicity stunt for her. She was hardcore anti-war personality, but obviously that's sort of like traitorous behavior to go over and give aid and comfort to the enemy and make nice to the enemy and stuff like that. So basically your average Vietnam vet hates this lady's guts for good reason too. Anyway, moving on here, I'm gonna pretty much try and wrap up the war here quickly and succinctly in this lecture. So just a quick orientation here on U.S. goals at this time frame. So mind you, now we have Nixon as the president. It's the early 1970s, and the Nixon administration and the country is trying to get out of this war. We want to take our troops home, but we also want to maintain the independence of the South Vietnamese people and have them be a country that can stand on its own. So that's really our goals here with Nixon as president. He does start pulling out the U.S. combat troops, and people are saying, well, you know, if you couldn't really get it done with U.S. combat troops in there, how are just the South Vietnamese combat troops going to get it done all by themselves? Well, they were never totally by themselves. They always had a little bit of help. And Nixon's very smart here because he looks at North Vietnam in 1971, and he thinks to himself, what are some of the things that the North Vietnamese have that's really keeping them afloat here? External things, not the things in North Vietnam that they control themselves. Well, they have the Viet Cong in the south. They have Russia. They're getting weapons and equipment from Russia, money. China helps them out. The U.S. peace movement helps them out. So he's going to start trying to get rid of some of these things, and he does it in a very smart way. In February of 1972, he goes to visit China, and you know, China's this huge country. Probably not going to do a very good job of drawing it here, but it kind of does like one of these sorts of things, yeah, like that. And then there's Taiwan right here. Well, throughout the entire Cold War, or at least since about 1949, when China became Red China, Communist China, we, the Americans, only recognized Taiwan right here. They're out kind of in the ocean there as a little island. We recognize Taiwan as that's good guy China. So when we send ambassadors to China, they go to little pipsqueak Taiwan. They didn't go to mainland Red China. So Nixon starts to go make nice with China. He goes and visits communist China. He shocks everyone. He shocks all the people in the United States. He shocks the Chinese. He shocks the North Vietnamese. Everyone in the world's shocked because Nixon is very much a strong anti-communist guy. So he's trying to kick that leg of the chair out. Kick that out. In later that year, in the spring, May of 1972, Nixon goes and visits Russia. So he's trying to kick out this leg of the stool too. I mean, if Russia and the Americans aren't really at odds and adversarial with each other that much anymore, maybe the Russians won't be so generous with giving aid to the North Vietnamese. Maybe they figure we don't need it that much. So he gets rid of that. Nixon got rid of the draft. I mean, do you guys ever wonder why your older brothers aren't drafted now? There's no draft anymore. Nixon got rid of the draft. It really got rid of a lot of the steam from the peace movement. So what's Hanoi going to do? So mind you, if you're following along, I'm really looking at page 13, page 14 of our notes here. So that should kind of wrap us up for the rest of the game. But Hanoi figures we're in trouble. We've expended all this blood and treasure, all this effort to subdue the South and make them part of our communist Vietnam, and we didn't get it. And if we lose China and Vietnam, or even if they, China and Russia, or even if they just slow down the aid, we're not going to get it done. So what they do is they have the 1972 Easter Offensive. The 1972 Easter Offensive, so-called. It just took place around Easter. So what they did was they launched an all-out attack similar to what they did in 1968 with the Tet Offensive. The only difference being this time it's much more of a conventional war. When I say conventional, I mean the opposite of guerrilla war. So you could maybe picture in your mind's eye tanks rolling down the roads, columns of troops marching down the roads, an actual, like an old school war like World War II, not the guerrilla warfare kind of stuff with the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are mostly wiped out after the Tet Offensive, so there's not much there either in helping them in the South. And the question for everybody was, are the South Vietnamese going to stand? Will ARVN stand? ARVN, the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, will they stand on their own in 1972 without U.S. combat troops? I mean, there were very few U.S. combat troops there, but Nixon was able to recognize this and use massive amounts of American air power to come in and just completely squash the North Vietnamese offensive, just obliterated thousands and thousands and thousands of guys. And the ARVN fought strong and they fought bravely, and they showed everyone, yes, the ARVN can stand on their own. They can fight it out. So ARVN stands strong and shocks everybody. Mind you, the U.S. is trying to get out of the Vietnam commitment to a large extent. There are peace negotiations in Paris. Seems like it's always in Paris, doesn't it? But anyway, peace negotiations in Paris with the North Vietnamese and the Americans. South Vietnamese are there, Viet Cong are there, and the North Vietnamese start to play games with the Americans. They start to agree to stuff, and they're like, well, we don't want to agree to all this, and then they start to pull back, and Nixon initiates something called the 1972 Christmas bombing. It doesn't sound very nice, does it? But what he really wanted to do was just bomb these guys silly and get them back to the bargaining table. So this had happened before to a certain extent with Operation Rolling Thunder. That's Lyndon B. Johnson's bombing campaign against the North. But with Nixon, his operation was called Linebacker. There's Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2. And the Linebacker operations had much less restrictions and rules on where the pilots could fly, how they picked targets and stuff like that. Rolling Thunder was very, very restrictive and probably cost some pilots their lives. But after that, Hanoi does return back to the bargaining table and go back and start to negotiate in maybe a little more good faith, they are commies. At the bottom of page 13, I've got the American political scene. What is the American political scene circa late 1972? Well, if you're Nixon, it's good. Nixon wins the 1972 election. It's a complete drubbing. Nixon destroys his opponent. He wins 49 states. He won 49 states in 1972. So the American people liked what he was doing. And the thing with old Nixon, though, was he was kind of paranoid. He'd really gotten kicked around before several times. He got beat by like a hair's breadth by John F. Kennedy in 1960. A little while after that, he lost the governorship for California. I mean, when he came back and won in 1968, that was really a resurrection from the dead from him. He was a political dead man. It was a Lazarus kind of move for him. So he always had to have assurances that he was going to win. And part of this paranoia led him to approve of something called, the plumbers. The plumbers weren't really plumbers. The plumbers were a group of guys who were basically burglars. They were thieves who would break into places, and they broke into the Watergate Hotel. And what's now known as the Watergate scandal occurred on Nixon's watch and with his knowledge of it and approval. Essentially, these plumbers broke into the Watergate Hotel because the Democrat Party had set up their headquarters there, and the plumbers were going to go in and basically spy on them. What would they be doing? Spying on, I don't know, where the Democrats are going to call people to put out yard signs or something like that. It's all election kind of stuff. It's not like a military type spying, but it's electioneering type spying, and they get caught. They got caught red-handed. So that unraveled, definitely under the intense media scrutiny. The media was all over it. The news media people were intensely interested in this, and eventually that's going to pretty much end Nixon's presidency. But that still takes 2 years, even with finding out about it, as a police matter, even with the news media people like really pursuing it doggedly. It still takes about 2 years to pretty much push Nixon out. So I'll get back to that in a little bit. 1973, they do hammer out an agreement, Hanoi, the U.S., and Saigon. So what does Hanoi get out of this agreement? There's basically recognition of two governments in South Vietnam, the legitimate government, but they also recognize that there is a communist sort of subculture government there. They also get to leave troops there in South Vietnam. I mean, you look at that and it's pretty obvious. Why would you want to leave 150,000 troops in South Vietnam? Duh, because you're a bad actor and you're not going to respect the peace agreement, but it's what they had to do. The U.S., we got our POWs returned. Pilots that got shot down over North Vietnam, guys who were captured in combat, stuff like that, they were all returned to the United States. I think one guy was in the Hanoi Hilton for like 7 years. So it was a long war. But U.S. gets their POWs returned. Then pretty much we can leave the country and we can declare victory and leave. Saigon, the Saigon government in the South was recognized as an independent country, and they got assurances from Nixon that, like in 1972 for the Easter Offensive, right here, if the communists come back again and they need our help, hey, put up the bat signal. Nixon's going to come in with the B-52s, with the 7th Fleet aircraft from the aircraft carriers, and we'll just wipe out the communists again. So that's basically the agreement that gets hammered out there in 1973. The South isn't happy. Nobody's really totally happy with it, but that's how compromise is a lot of time. Also on that page, I have the 1973 War Powers Act. This was an act passed by Congress, and it went to basically limit the powers of the president in terms of making war. So if you look at how we got started into this whole conflict, there's Lyndon B. Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and Congress basically wrote out like maybe a page or a half page long permission slip to give LBJ the permission to go to war. It wasn't a declaration of war like you saw in 1942 or 1941, but it was just sort of permission slip. And they had what you would call buyer's remorse. They wished they hadn't done that as a body in Congress. So they created this War Powers Act, which limits the war-making ability of the president. Still exists today. little bit later, down in the story there, 1974, August of 1974, Nixon leaves office. This Watergate scandal had unwound to a point where he was being directly implicated in the activities of this plumbers unit that was, breaking into the Watergate Hotel and spies and all that. And he got caught essentially, and he was about to be, impeached and have his trial sent over to the Senate for a real hearing to see if he's guilty or not. And he decided just to resign. He quit. He's the only president ever that resigned in office. So within 2 years, he went from winning 49 states, and American people think he's doing a good job, to resigning because he was going to be disgraced by an impeachment. So he had to leave. His successor is a guy named Ford. Gerald Ford takes over, and he's going to be the new president. The communists decide to try and test out the new administration in Washington, D.C., and they launch sort of an invasion just on a provincial level. Remember, a province is like a state in Vietnam, a provincial level, and they invade and pretty much take over this place called Phuc Long. And what they want to do is they want to see, what are the Americans going to do this time? It's been a couple years. They've saved up their forces and their men and material again and built that up since 1972. So they attack Phuc Long, and nothing really happens. They get some angry words from Gerald Ford, but that's really about it. So after that, they launched this 1975 invasion, which is, I guess you could say, really the final invasion. And they're pretty successful. This is it. This is basically the coup de grace. They try and, the South tries to fortify the whole country, but as they say in warfare, if you try to protect everything, you protect nothing. The president of South Vietnam, Thu, realizes after a while that this is a problem, so he tries to pull his forces back to certain areas where they're the more highly important areas. We'll just protect, the areas around Saigon in the south where we make rice, maybe a couple little cities up in the north, and just abandon the jungles and everything and just let the communists have it. So as he's doing that and his troops are pulling back, it becomes a huge debacle, because if you're a person that's a rice farmer or something, let's say, or you're in some village and you see all the South Vietnamese troops leaving, what's going to happen to you? Those people are scared. They saw what happened when the communists took over in 1968 in Hue City, and they just massacred a bunch of people, thousands of people. So all these people were like, oh, the army's leaving. Well, I'm leaving too. And they all try to leave. And it becomes a huge traffic jam. The North Vietnamese are attacking. It's a mess. Also, you see the mess of the government's policy on enlisting and drafting these soldiers and putting them in units far from their home. Sometimes they would leave to go help out their family. They would desert their post. It's perfectly understandable in that situation, but it doesn't help. And their families needed them, so it was a big problem. Let's read something from this book right here. Modern Guerrilla Insurgency by Dr. Joes. By 1973, South Vietnam is becoming what the Americans said they wanted it to be: a country with a stable government and at least some external attributes of democracy. The war also had become what Americans always said they wanted it to be: not an ostensible guerrilla conflict, but a clear-cut conventional campaign of conquest by Hanoi. In such a war, the ARVN needed only American supplies and air support to stand up to the best efforts of the NVA, as the 1972 offensive had demonstrated. And precisely at that conjunction of all these favorable developments, precisely when South Vietnam was in the best shape it had ever been, the United States Congress decided to repudiate and abandon its ally. The Americans slashed their aid to the south while the Soviets continued theirs to the north. It was in these circumstances that President Thu attempted a retrenchment that turned into disaster. The Americans watched while North Vietnam proceeded to trample on a peace agreement that the United States had signed a scant 2 years before, and launched perhaps the largest conventional invasion Asia had seen in 30 years. In the face of this invasion, South Vietnam's American-trained and American-equipped armed forces ground to a halt for lack of American supplies. In Hanoi's 1972 Easter offensive, the South Vietnamese, bolstered by U.S. air power and supplies, repulsed General Giap's best efforts. In Hanoi's 1975 offensive, the South Vietnamese, deprived of promised U.S. support, were destroyed. But that was not the whole of the U.S. legacy to South Vietnam. For years, what had passed for American strategy permitted Hanoi to construct so-called neutral neighboring states, a complex of major military highways like a noose around South Vietnam. When the Americans abandoned their allies, the outflanked South Vietnamese fell victim to the geography of Indochina that enabled Hanoi to substitute invasion for subversion. Maybe they could have held on, but Congress by 1975 was very hostile. A lot of the people who were your peace demonstrators and stuff like that, they vote too, and they didn't win the presidency, but they put a lot of their people in the Congress. The so-called New Left is what they were called. So these guys yanked support for the South Vietnamese. They had a rich man's army. They had an American-style army, very road-bound, very heavy, and without proper American support, they couldn't carry on the war. Not very effectively anyway. They could have fought on and maybe got something out of it. By the time they did surrender, they still had Saigon. They still had the major places in the far South Vietnam, the rice-producing regions of the Mekong Delta, and some people thought that maybe they could turn Saigon into a sort of Asian Stalingrad, where the North Vietnamese came in and just wore themselves out with urban warfare and just had to quit the fight. But wasn't going to happen. They surrendered, and that was basically it. Effects on the U.S. This is for many years after, really, the war. We had what was called Vietnam Syndrome, which was a reluctance for the American leadership and military to engage militarily if there were some sort of bad actors or something bad going on there. The military was broken to a large extent. The U.S. military that went into Vietnam in the early and mid 1960s was good. It was a really sharp military. But the military that straggled out of there in the 1970s was pretty broken down. They had drug problems, racial problems. They didn't get a good budget from the government anymore, so they didn't have the best equipment and stuff like that. The morale was bad. People weren't proud to be in the military at all. The economy in the United States was very poor through the 1970s. And Jimmy Carter summed it up and basically said that we had a malaise going on in the 1970s. And he had a big famous speech. And if you're a hockey fan like me, they actually have it in the opening credits of the movie Miracle, the Disney movie Miracle, where the U.S. team goes out and beats the Soviets in 1980. But they put part of his speech in the opening credits. What about the effects on Vietnam? Was it a communist utopia? Was everything like heaven on earth there? Not really. They had a lot of poverty. They lived in a police state, a tyranny, essentially. They also had wars and local conflicts with their neighbors. They fought China. They fought Cambodia. So they actually had a lot of little fights around there. There were these sort of like just ethnic wars with local neighbors that they had, because it wasn't necessarily friendly between them. They just were partners out of convenience against the United States. So it wasn't really necessarily wonderful for them either. What about now, though? What if you go to South Vietnam now? Or I would just call it just Vietnam. I guess there's not really a North and South anymore. What if you go there now? Well, they like Americans. We didn't necessarily overwhelmingly win the war, but you could maybe say we win the peace. If you look at your shoes or your sweatshirt or something like that, sometimes you'll see made in Vietnam. So they like America now. Maybe not the top echelon of their leadership, but it seems like with China becoming so powerful, they're afraid they might get gobbled up. So they like America in ways that they never liked America before. And individually, if you went there, they'd be interested to talk to you. They'd want to like get to know you and check you out, and just because you'd be a very new person there. They probably don't get a lot of foreign people in there. It's just kind of like Vietnamese people there. But things are definitely better now in the last couple years between the U.S. and Vietnam than they were, say, through my childhood in the 80s and all that, where we just remembered the war and we're trying to forget about all that. But things have gotten better, so who knows? All right, guys, I think that's going to end us for this afternoon. Thanks very much. Bye bye.